Welcome to another episode of the World War Now, everybody. I'm your host, Dmitriy, joined today by my two lovely guests, contributors and colleagues to the show, Isaac and GSP. They've been with us before on previous World War Now episodes during some eventful times. I believe the last time we've collaborated with Isaac and GSP, it was on the fall of Syria in those first weeks of December 2024, almost a year ago now. So very eventful episode. And we're back, of course, to discuss many important things. My, of course, main co-host, Conrad, today is unavailable because he at the moment is in the SMO zone in Russia, traveling around Crimea, all of those great places to bring you some of our premium content, I think, from the frontlines themselves and also from some of those great people that he's been interviewing recently. Speaking of which, just as an aside, make sure to check out our Substack, worldwarnow.co. There's a very interesting interview that just dropped. It is a 23-minute video of Conrad interviewing Gabriel Doroshin, a descendant of both Napoleon Bonaparte and the Romanov and the Rurikid dynasty. So he's a very interesting young man under the age of 30, and Conrad is speaking to him very frankly about the future of Russia, Orthodox Christian monarchy, and all these other things. So literally an aristocrat, a veteran of the SMO war, a veteran of the 2014-2015 conflict. And we will have a live stream discussing Gabriel Doroshin, his particular lineage, and who this person is, dropping sometime this week. So definitely be on the lookout on the World War Now Substack on YouTube. So be on the lookout for that live stream. Yeah, it's really one of those rare opportunities that Conrad got to meet him and actually speak to somebody who's already contributed so much to Russian independence in what is now known as Ukraine. So really awesome. Isaac, GSP, thank you for joining. There's been a lot of things that have taken place over the last week or two in relation to Gaza, the Middle East, where I think we will begin our analysis this week. Clearly, a lot of people are, on one hand, very thankful that the mass slaughter and genocide of the Palestinian people has stopped. On the other hand, we're very wary that, of course, there is no accountability or culpability being held by the Israelis. Netanyahu is not in a prison cell. His court trials are being adjourned, delayed, of course, being prolonged. Israel is looking hungrily at other places in the Middle East in order to extend its suzerainty, for example, into the West Bank, even though we did have J.D. Vance actually coincidentally on camera very openly, which was, I think, somewhat controversial. And he didn't visit the wall after he said this as well. So I just want to note that. He has, I believe, visited the wall several times prior to this, but something I think triggered him a little bit. J.D. Vance on camera said, look, the Trump administration does not support Israeli settlements in the West Bank. And this was, of course, commented on by Israeli politicians, Ben-Gvir and Netanyahu. They said, well, look, the US officials, they say this all the time, and they kind of disparagingly, almost disrespectfully, sort of shoot away J.D. Vance's approach in their own interviews and commentaries onto it. But in any case, Israel is looking to expand also into South Lebanon. We have, of course, the Lebanese government, maybe for the first time since October 7th, actually make critical statements towards Israel in terms of actually looking somewhat hawkish and self-defensive. For the first time, a nation's government is standing up for its own sovereignty. So we can be thankful for that. So regular international relations conditions are finally kicking in the Middle East, and also, of course, southwestern Syria. There's also always a concern going on there because that regime at the moment that has taken root in Damascus, not only is it ill-prepared for any sort of Israeli expansion into Syria, hypothetically speaking, but it's also, of course, led by former members of al-Qaeda, Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, HTS, so people who you could literally label as former terrorists, and that would give Israel, of course, a pretext to continue their war against radical Islamism, as this is the excuse they've used, of course, in the West Bank and in Gaza. And I would say they've sort of abused that pretext and that leverage position for a long time now. And of course, that's led to the deaths of over 100,000 plus Palestinians at this point. And I suppose I'll begin with our good friend Isaac. Isaac, given that you are a Christian Palestinian, you have relatives who are Muslim Palestinians, you are yourself, of course, you and your family are from the West Bank, but in any case, the Palestinian nation is one and united. What are the general views? I think they're mostly positive in relation to the so-called Trump peace deal that he signed between Israel and between Hamas. However, we all note that these 20 points of Trump's, some of them are simply unfulfillable in the long term. So, if anything, this seems to be, unfortunately, and I don't want to sound too pessimistic, but it does appear to be a temporary reprieve. Maybe you can comment on that and maybe give us some of your thoughts about what exactly has transpired in the Holy Land, in essentially your heritage homeland over the last month or so.
I want to thank you again for having me on. Thank you again for letting me speak on these issues. So, yes, many people are, especially the people in Gaza, are glad that the bombing has generally stopped. However, that hasn't stopped Israel from engaging in selective strikes for supposed reasons of claiming that Hamas has either broken the ceasefire. They're claiming that they might even invade again, primarily because they say that 3 bodies that Hamas gave them don't match up with 3 hostages that were killed. I'm not entirely sure on the truth of these claims. I don't think Hamas would purposely give wrong remains. It's likely either it was a mistake or frankly it's just not true. In terms of what's happening in the Gaza Strip, while people are glad that the overall violence has subsided, the aid has been shut off. The aid that was supposed to be going into the Gaza Strip after the ceasefire started has been shut off. You're having an issue with people not being able to get the medicine they need. There's this growing concern, frightening concern of babies not getting the nutrients they need, babies in hospitals, and people are still very hungry. And it does look and seem as if the Israeli government is simply looking for a pretext to go in again and quote unquote finish the job, as it were, because Hamas has made it very clear. While they don't want to govern the Gaza Strip anymore, they haven't wanted to govern the Gaza Strip for a very long time. They're not willing to relinquish it to anything other than a Palestinian chosen government, not to some sort of international force, not to some kind of chosen technocrats. A Palestinian chosen government elected by the Palestinian people are the only people that they're willing to give control of the Gaza Strip over. And they're not willing to lay down their arms unless they know that this Palestinian force is, able to defend the Gaza Strip. The problem with the document is that on its basis, it's essentially something of a surrender document because of the demands on Hamas and because of the demands on the Gaza Strip as a whole. There's this talk of, we need to de-radicalize the Gaza Strip, so we need to engage in we need to engage in educational programs to do so, and we have to change how the people in Gaza are educated. And yeah, I'm pessimistic myself. I'm very glad that the people in Gaza are at least able to have some reprieve and some relief, but I'm very pessimistic for the future. In terms of what's happening in the West Bank, the fire has just turned up to the maximum. You've had hundreds of attacks on Palestinian villages, Christian and Muslim, by Israeli settlers in the past several months. People have been killed. People's livestock has been killed. I saw this one very brutal video on Twitter of Israeli Jewish settlers going into a stable and just literally grabbing lambs by their legs and just beating them onto the floor until they die. Cars being set on fire, hay being set on fire, people being hurt. There's this one very even more brutal video of an Israeli settler, very infamous video of a Jewish settler beating a 55-year-old woman with a club. There's a picture of him standing over her with, club in hand while she's lying on the ground. The violence in the West Bank is getting worse and worse, and the IDF isn't doing anything about it. That woman, it was in the village of Tayafa Masar. I'm probably saying it wrong because I can't remember the name of the village. It was a man named Jasper Nathaniel that was recording it, and he made enough of a stink on Twitter that the IDF brought out a statement saying that they were going to investigate and that, they were going to, I guess, leave the village alone. We'll see how that goes because the village of Taiba was attacked again the other day, and it's just a constant and consistent violence against these people in the West Bank, and nothing's being done about it.
The video that you're talking about where they storm into a Palestinian farm, I mean, there's parts of it involved like them gouging out the eyes of a lamb. These people are sick. It's a sick, spoiled population. It is a sick and spoiled population.
Like in that same video, they take like this baby lamb, grab it by the legs and just bash it on the ground until it's dead. And then they take another, bash it, and then they grab this big concrete block and smash its head with it. I mean, it's really brutal to watch, man.
And a few days before the attack on the farm, they set a church on fire. It boggles my mind that that's one of the problems with American Christians, with Protestants, is they also have like a chosenite attitude. Like they believe they're the real Christians. Everybody's not as Christian as they are. So they don't have a concern for like historical Christians in the Middle East. They have no concern. I mean, they've literally chosen Jews over Christians.
I remember several months ago when an IDF tank tried to blow off the cross of the steeple of the Holy Family Catholic Church in Gaza, and the debris and the shrapnel killed 3 Christians. And Joel Berry, the infamous editor, I guess, owner or editor of the Babylon Bee, within 2 days, he went from the IDF didn't mean it to, oh, well, they're all Hamas anyway. And then he justified it by saying, oh, well, there are no real Palestinian Christians. They're all Hamas. And the only ones that are real Christians are hiding and they don't talk. It's disgusting. Miserable and filthy behavior.
Like, how many people know this? That the Jews wanted to regain Jerusalem in the late 6th century. And it's primarily because of Muhammad that they were able to take Jerusalem from the Christians. And it is from here that many Jews that were still present in the Holy Land, in Palestine, converted to Islam. Of course, there were many that were, of course, Christian. Now, the first Nakba removed many of those Christians. And it's been an Israeli policy and, cucked Western governments to ship these people out. They've bribed them. I have met at least 2 different Middle Eastern Arab Christians who came to Canada because, well, one of them was Palestinian and it was part of the first Nakba. They settled in Lebanon and from there they moved to Canada. But the other one wasn't. They were from Syria. And so these offers are always there to make sure to remove the Christians from that land because it's an affront to Jews. Of course, Protestants can't relate to this. They're incapable. I mean, very few of them. There's some mainstream Protestant churches that kind of get it, but, forget the evangelicals. I mean,
even the ones that kind of get it walk on eggshells because they don't want to be seen as offending the Jewish community in America. Like, you're not wrong. When the Nakba happened in 1948, of the approximately 750,000 Palestinians that were expelled from their homes, around 10% of them were Christians, like between I think 60 to 75,000 of them were Christians. It was actually quite proportionate to the overall population. What a lot of people it's not even that they don't get it, they just don't care at this point because people have seen it. They've seen 2 years of this. They've seen the slaughter of women and children. They saw the killing of the Christians in Gaza and some Christians being attacked in the West Bank. In particular, there's this very poor story of this poor girl from Ramallah. Her name's Lian Nasser. And she's like 22, 23. And she spent the past 2 years in and out of Israeli jails for no charges. She has not been accused of anything. And the Israelis just consistently harass her, and her family is just like beyond themselves. They want their daughter back. And this is she's like 5'2". She barely weighs 110 soaking wet. I mean, but they don't care. And the reason why is that it's why I'm personally just sick of this whole talk of Islamophobia. Is like, yes, sure, there are people who obviously hate Muslims for the fact that they hate Islam, but the attitude that these people are taking towards the Palestinians, whether they are Muslim or Christian, is because they just hate Arabs. When they it doesn't matter to them that these Arabs are Christians. Like Joel Berry just hates Arabs. That's why when he says, "Oh, they're all Hamas," that's just him. That's basically him saying, "Oh, well, they're just Arabs. Who cares?" And that's what a lot of this is. And that's, I think, what's frustrating about it, like trying to get people to understand that. It's why the American government will, rightfully so, decry the treatment of Nigerian Christians, but at the same time, they will support. Oh, they'll ignore the Christians being slaughtered in Syria. Yeah.
And in Israel, for that matter. I've never heard mainstream news talk about what Israel is doing to Christians in Palestine. I've never seen that.
Well, I wanted to mention GSP and Isaac because that's actually quite key. And this is exactly what we'll see is whenever Trump brings out the issue of, for example, and when, of course, the World War now doesn't exactly analyze everything Trump says. We understand this is a man, this is a character, in and of himself. So he is his own television show, right? There will be, I think, entire books dedicated to Trump's sayings during his 2 presidential terms later on, and they will be thousands of pages long, and they will analyze whether or not what he said was true, what the true, he is like Sun Tzu in his own way, right? So philosophically speaking. But Trump did always emphasize, of course, the loss of life in the world and how he is the peace-loving president, except for when it comes to the greatest ally, so to speak, in the face of Israel. When Israel fights Islamism, that's when Islamism is bad. When it's time to shake hands with al-Julani, former, right-hand man of literally Osama bin Laden in Iraq. So his lieutenant, Sheikh, I think it's Mahmoud Abu al-Julani was the full name back in 2016 before he changed his name. Again, I'm not sure why all of that took place in the first case, but maybe it was to protect, as we now realize, the al-Shara extended family, which apparently was quite branched out to begin with. So here's, that's a character in and of himself. We could almost have a whole episode on al-Julani in the future, but he's visiting the White House sometime in the near future now. It's been announced on multiple media sites. So that's an actual Islamist, right, who's chopped heads off, who has prayed with suicide bombers in Syria prior to them going out and carrying out their heinous deeds. That is an actual Islamic extremist. Say what you will about Hamas, and yet Trump shakes hands with him. And of course, this breaks the back of the war on terror psychology, which was spoon-fed to Americans over the last 2 decades. Not saying the entire concept of the war on terror was wrong. The point is that it was essentially a psychological operation, first and foremost, against the American and Western population to essentially create this greater boogeyman that could be used to further what's and now appears to be, what is the outcome of the war on terror? It's a stronger Israel, right? And just speaking of Trump, right, at the moment, literally as we're recording this on the 2nd of November, Sunday afternoon, Donald Trump, in a speech to the Republican Jewish coalition, actually stated that he laments that he only received 32% of the Jewish vote. And I'm quoting Trump here. "I can't imagine we didn't do better than that. After all I've done for the Jewish vote, I must be honest with you." So he's not very happy. And at the same time, I'll note what other Israeli media channels are reporting right now as we're recording. So Israeli Channel 12 is reporting peak tension on the Israeli northern front. A month from now, the Lebanese government deadline for Hezbollah's disarmament in Lebanon ends. Now, the Lebanese tensions, of course, are front, which we've spoken about with yourself, GSP, and Isaac many times before. And I just have to note that it appears now that the troops are in a mode of, say, patrolling or more or less in an armed preparatory state down in the southwest on the Gaza Strip, on those artificial borders which Trump essentially created on the land of the Palestinians in Gaza, or already constricting movement. Not that it wasn't constricted before, but they've lost even more land technically. So the Palestinian people are even more caged in. Now the Israeli army, especially the heavy tanks, Merkava tanks and other vehicles, can focus perhaps on a new front. This is the very unfortunate thing is yes, there's peace on one particular end here. And yes, peace is very relatively speaking here because every time a Palestinian crosses over this yellow line that Trump drew on the map, the Israelis killed him. And I think this week there's been at least a few Palestinian casualties who have, unfortunately wandered onto the wrong side of the rubble created by Israel. So there are constantly civilian casualties. These aren't Hamas people. These are just, as Isaac said, these are people who look Arabic, therefore they must be some sort of Hamas collaborators, and Israel shoots first and asks questions later. It's basically no man's land in a trench warfare type situation. And Benjamin Netanyahu also, and I have to quote this quasi-demonic figure, actually just today he mentioned the Ansar Allah front in Yemen is a very serious threat to Israel, and we will do everything we can to remove it. So we know Israel is now, Isaac, it's looking at essentially the other opportunities it still has while the world is more or less distracted with all this other news. And before, of course, Iran crosses another unspeakable line, right, which will maybe prompt further escalations between the two countries. So Israel is looking to take as much ground as possible, both physically and in terms of establishing itself amongst its neighbors as literally the predominant power. Not that it wasn't already, but now, of course, nobody's really looking to double cross Israel. Jordan is absolutely subservient. Egypt is not even going to raise an eyelid as to what's taking place here. But it's quite curious, Isaac, as you said earlier, Lebanese people are technically not even Arab. These are Phoenicians. Yes, some of them are Arabized. These are literally ancient people who've lived on this land since the times of preceding Alexander the Great's adventures in the Middle East. And many of them, they have huge communities in Western countries. So many people are familiar with Lebanese culture, Lebanese cuisine, etc. And yet Lebanon is the one country that's currently on a weekly basis being bombed by Israel indiscriminately. And Lebanese casualties, both Christian and Muslim alike, are just hitting the news stories every single week. It's almost getting repetitive. And we have to ask ourselves, like, hold on, but if there's constantly women and children dying, these aren't members of Hezbollah, where exactly is Israel aiming with these warplanes? And now officially, for the first time, I think, in almost 12 months, the president of Lebanon has stated that, essentially the Lebanese army, the official army of Lebanon, which is, the Lebanese army, we've said certain questionable things about it in the past in terms of it's not that big, nor is it as capable as maybe you could say the Israeli army on the ground, but they are no doubt patriotic, and they have been seeing what Israel has been doing to them, especially flying planes not far from Beirut, dropping bombs on suburbs with civilians in them. It's roughly the same size, maybe a bit larger than Hezbollah. Perhaps you can argue that they're less experienced. However, the Lebanese army is preparing to, it seems, potentially mobilize and head south of the Litani River to establish potential peacekeeping positions, we'll just call it that, on their own territory in case Israel thinks that now is a good opportunity, just like in 2006, which didn't end so well for them, to actually go in and maybe take some more land potentially, now that, of course, the Gaza Strip has been so-called, so to speak, pacified. I think it's very interesting, Isaac, the scenarios that this opens up. And at the same time, it appears for now, at least the southwest of Syria has calmed down. There's been, now that al-Julani is flying around, he seems to have received the green light from Russia, the green light from America. This particular Islamic extremist is acceptable, right? Because he's not an anti-Zionist, right? The rest of them are all evil, right? Because they don't like Israel. But if you like Israel and you're a member of Al-Qaeda, you're all good in the book of the globalists, so to speak. So it's, quite curious how all these things are developing. And yes, if you could speak on Lebanon, Isaac, and how that ties together into the greater Holy Land mosaic, because all this land essentially is tied to all these biblical stories, which we love and we read and we hear at the liturgy every single week. And yet this is exactly where these crimes are taking place.
Definitely. The big thing is that the Lebanese government knows that it's in a very hard position. It cannot claim to want Hezbollah to dismantle in the name of respecting Lebanese sovereignty, while Israeli Israeli planes are bombing Lebanese farmers as they try to, because right now is the harvest season for the olives, and Lebanese farmers need to be escorted by not just Lebanese troops, but the UNIFIL, United Nations Forces in Lebanon, forces, just so that they can have protection while they, harvest their olives and, their other crops, because there's a real possibility that the Israelis will bomb them and kill them. There was this, I think about a month or two ago, a Lebanese American family. These were American citizens who were visiting southern Lebanon. The entire family was killed in an Israeli airstrike. No association with Hezbollah. In fact, most of these people being killed in southern Lebanon have no association with Hezbollah besides maybe just a general, I support Hezbollah or I know who they are, I'm fine with them, but they're not associated with them. And either way, and the point is to try to create pressure within the Lebanese government to get Hezbollah dismantled. But that's not happening. Hezbollah will not dismantle. The reports I've read have shown that Hezbollah is slowly reconstituting itself. It seems that they've learned a lot, obviously, from the 2024 war, from last year's war. And they are claiming that they will be able to face Israel again if the Israelis invade Lebanon. Now, to be fair, it has to be understood that while that war, the 2024 war, was a strategic victory for Israel in the sense that they were able to kill a lot of the leadership, they were able to localize Hezbollah, especially since Bashar al-Assad fell, it was tactically a defeat. The Israelis were not able to go further than 5 kilometers into Lebanese territory. They just weren't able to do it. The Hezbollah proved itself able to repel ground attacks and ground incursions at every opportunity. And the Israelis, I think, are again going to have a very hard time trying to engage in any kind of ground operations in southern Lebanon. And the hope and the belief is that Hezbollah has learned how to deal with intelligence leaks, how to deal with any kind of treachery. They learned the mistakes they made, and they're claiming that this time around, the Israelis will not win anything tactically or strategically. This will be a serious test for Naim Qassem, the current chairman of Hezbollah. Will he be able to lead? Will he be able to command his troops? Does he have the foresight and the vision and the capability that Hassan Nasrallah had? There's a lot of pressure on him, and there's a lot of expectations on him. So we'll see how capable and how able he is. I mean, God willing, he'll do as well, if not better, than Hassan Nasrallah. And I think a lot of this is basically why the Lebanese government is starting to really bear some teeth, as it were. Tom Barak, the American envoy to Lebanon, he's made a lot of he's made a lot of inflammatory statements towards the Lebanese that are biting him in the back. And he's saying it's a failed state. And he's saying that, you guys need to stop acting like savages, very, very inflammatory statements. And I think the Lebanese government knows that in order for it to be taken seriously, they have to be seen doing something at the very least. And I think you're going to find they're going to ease off of Hezbollah over the next couple months, and they're going to start demanding more from Israel. Get out of southern Lebanon. Leave our farmers alone. Stop killing our people. Because here's the thing. Twitter is Twitter. But by the end of the day, everyone in Lebanon knows that the government cannot claim to want to be sovereign or to demand sovereignty from Hezbollah while the Israelis still occupy certain parts of southern Lebanon, and they bomb Lebanon on the regular. So we'll see what happens from that. In terms of Syria, I've just written Syria off. I was worried at some point that HTS would manage to spread into Jordan or possibly Iraq. I'm not sure that's possible, because the reality is that al-Julani really only controls Damascus and the surrounding regions, Aleppo, Homs, and Hama. He does not seem to have much control over Sweda and southwestern Syria. The Druze have...
Even Damascus is questionable.
It is.
It seems like there are some swaths of Damascus that he doesn't have control over. And now the Druze are asking for independence.
Yeah. And the Druze asking independence is what the Israelis wanted. He obviously doesn't control northeastern Syria. In terms of the coastal regions, the Alawites made the mistake of giving up their arms, but now it seems that the Coastal Shield Brigade is trying to basically make their presence known. There were a couple of attacks by what probably were them against HTS, convoys and patrols. Syria is basically in a chaotic state. There is no government, not really. The prices of goods have skyrocketed to beyond belief. There's no functional government in any real state.
And extrajudicial killings are still going on. I just read the case of two two young men who were tied up and killed. And I don't think they were even Shia. They were suspected of being in the military when it was under Assad's control. But they're still, I mean, Julani's men are still these like ravenous savages that still do
Yeah.
these extrajudicial killings. Because for the most part, the Sunni Muslims in that region live in a fantasy camp. They've been, like, I don't know if they know that for the rest of the world, they look completely cocked. Like for non-Muslims, the Shia look honorable, chivalric, willing to do the utmost. The Sunnis look pragmatic, weak, bending the knee. They don't look strong. They look like they're always calculating, unable to form a vision that isn't a reactionary vision to whatever Israel does. And in the long term, you have to, obviously, like after 9/11 happened, it took me about a year, maybe even less than a year, but let's say about a year after 9/11 happened, I understood that at that time, then, like, ultimately, this whole stupid war on terror is to create like a greater Israel and to destroy the Al-Aqsa Mosque. That's what it was. The initial building blocks that were established. You could talk about the Nakba, Ramallah in 2002, et cetera, but those were the small steps, but concrete steps nonetheless, to destroy any kind of contingent that could be formed in the Middle East. And now what you have is these extremely pragmatic and decadent Sunni countries who just bend the knee to whatever America and Israel want. At least that's how it seems.
Well, that's just how it is. I mean, that's just basically how it is. I mean, they are willing to bend the knee because they see the profit involved. I remember I see a lot of people talk about, well, look at Dubai and look at how rich and wealthy it is. I'm like, hey, the UAE is like only barely 11% Arab. Like the 88, 89% of its population are basically a class of slaves of Sunni slaves that they've imported from after the Horn of Africa and Southeast Asia.
Pakistan, yeah.
Those kind of societies don't last very long. like historically, maintaining a class of helots, a class of slaves that basically do nearly all of the work for you. Eventually, at a tipping point, the slaves either rise up or, especially if there's an economic crisis, they leave. And then what? I mean, you're going to expect Emirati Arabs to actually, work with their hands. It's like expecting a Hasidic Jew to work with his hands. But I just want to say, in terms of Syria's relationship with Russia, it's sad, but I think this is something where Putin had to do what one would call the pragmatic thing. It's obvious that neither Bashar nor his brother Maher are in a position to retake power. I keep hearing rumors about how, Maher is still in Iraq and he's got his troops ready to go. But I'll see it. I'll believe it when I see it.
The hidden
Julani is basically in Damascus and Bashar al-Assad isn't. And the Russians have an airfield and they've got the naval base. They want to maintain that. They have recognized, to their disappointment, I think their deep disappointment, that Julani's in power, and they have to deal with that as best they can. However that happens in the future, however long Julani lasts, I mean, I don't know. It's just as far as I'm concerned, at this point, the country just doesn't exist.
I would agree with that. I mean, I think that what will undo the regime in Syria will be the economic disaster that it is. Where will they receive funding to prop up this state? Initially, the goals were highly idealistic, but really they just have pragmatists in charge now after they deposed Assad. And just to go back to your other point, right? People literally have turned like pragmatism and profiteering as a kind of ideal. It's not an ideal. Like, you're living in like basically a materialist stage of your civilization. It doesn't, the reason you're making pragmatic decisions is because very few people of your own are willing to die. The only way you can keep them engaged is by providing a decent life. But they're not willing to sacrifice themselves, right? And that's what I mean. It appears to me that the entire Sunni region has essentially become decadent and materialistic. And of course, I'm sorry, but if you talk to a lot of Americans, they have the same attitude. Wealth is like wealth and freedom, the freedom to gain a lot of wealth, like are sacred, in American ideology. And I mean, what do you expect, right? It's that kind of thinking. Just from an outsider point of view, like the clock is ticking. Like they're eventually, there's a slight reprieve. Of course, children. It's estimated like 400 people, mostly children, have starved to death since the quote unquote ceasefire. Because Jews are. I've seen videos of Jews pushing their babies in baby carriages in front of big rigs loaded with food supplies for Gaza. I mean, these people are sick. They're sick. And, I hear people who say Israelis, they're Europeans. I mean, they're not anything. They're not Europeans. Europeans don't behave that way. You sicken us. That's not part of our moral code. You're not like us, and you never will be. But you're not also like them. Like, you don't belong anywhere. I'm sorry.
I will say this, it's like Israeli society, I have a friend of mine who's part Palestinian and I think, if I'm correct, her family has Israeli citizenship. They're, Israeli Arabs, as it were, and if you're a Palestinian in Israel, don't call yourself a Palestinian. You're just an Arab, right? You're just an Arab. And she told me, like you hang around Tel Aviv, and not just the nice parts, you go around what are basically the slums of Tel Aviv. You realize that Israel is like a parody of a Middle Eastern country. All of the vices with none of the virtues, as it were. Very, very rude people, not welcoming at all, very conniving. There's this thing about the Freier culture, and Freier, it's an old Yiddish word, but what it basically means is sucker, like don't be a sucker. And so Israelis have this consistent of every person they meet. How do I take advantage of him? Because he's going to take advantage of me. You have a sexual assault problem where Israeli men have this tendency to just rape women and they don't seem to see a problem with it.
Yeah.
And just a generally very decadent culture of, of just really mean, ugly, violent people. And yeah, I mean, it's like these people aren't Middle Easterns in any real sense of the word, or at the very least, they have all the worst qualities that the Middle East has. And I just wish, I don't know, Dmitry, do you think Putin would be able to take them into the Jewish autonomous zone?
Perhaps refugees, if they're left over after what's coming in the greater, say, the continuation of the 12-day war between Iran, possibly. And I think potentially, like, if those particular asylum seekers aren't actual rabid Zionists, right? They're not, for example, as you recall, there were literally Ukrainian Banderite refugees as well that sought, refuge in Canada, but they were like head choppers themselves of their own sort of Western Ukrainian kind, and yet they pretended to be these nice, essentially, refugees from the Second World War once they entered Western countries. So, I mean, everyone needs to be background checked, essentially. I wouldn't necessarily be against a small, so to speak, Talmudic colony being set up on the border of China. I know it's somewhat dangerous, but a future Russia, especially led by God willing, an Orthodox Tsar, knows how to deal with these sort of people in terms of isolating them to a certain extent. And I'm not advocating for any of that on the show in terms of policy. Of course, that will be up to an Orthodox Christian sovereign, not myself, for those decisions to be made. But there are precedents, right? And, just in terms of what exactly the West will be doing in the Middle East in the coming months, Isaac, I think the continued agitation, for example, against the Houthis in Yemen, right? Ansar Allah. We still don't appreciate how many tomahawks, because we talk about tomahawks in the context of Ukraine and Russia. America's used up at least several hundred tomahawks on Yemen in the last 12 months, just for reference. Like, it's an enormous amount of missiles. Like, and the issue of tomahawks, and this has been discussed by Russian political analysts recently and military analysts, is that they're great. Like, they work really well. They're super accurate, but they get used up pretty quick. You launch them very quickly, and every missile costs, there's a big price tag attached. So
they're not easily built.
Exactly. And really, if you look at the diversity and inclusion workforce in America, like, who is going to build these missiles? You know, you're going to have the, so to speak, African-American independent female pilot on your airliner situation constructing a Tomahawk. Like, things will be different. You won't be able to reconstruct the same quality as before. And so I think the entire military industrial complex, especially in the United States, it will also be impacted by all the great diversity that's been, essentially been brought in. But thank you, gentlemen. I think analysis was essentially, I think, on point. And I completely agree in relation to Syria. The only other really big story out of Syria, and again, this is quite fresh, so I guess we'll keep reporting on it, myself and Conrad, as the story develops, is that apparently the PKK, or Mazlum Abdi, essentially the leader of the Kurds in northeastern Syria, apparently in collaboration with the PKK, they've ordered the Kurds to begin moving towards Iraq away from Turkey. So there is a certain transition. Potentially, maybe there was a deal struck between Erdogan, Abdi, between al-Julani, the new, so to speak, president of Syria. And this would of course benefit the Turks greatly if the Kurds would finally demilitarize that northeastern point where they've been fighting essentially a multi-front war. However, we understand these big movements of armed forces, like the Kurds still control a giant army like this. We cannot underappreciate the size of the military they have at the moment. Yes, they're not as equipped as some of the other countries in the Middle East, but just 100,000 plus soldiers, that's not to be, underestimated.
Is there a legitimate fear that they'll want to carve out a part of Iraq and call it Kurdistan?
Well, that's probably what this is going towards, Isaac. I think exactly so. And I think our listeners will definitely appreciate the fact that, this is Erdogan essentially saying, well, this is Iraq's problem now. And Iraq obviously is not the Iraq of Saddam Hussein or even preceding that. This is a weakened, divided Iraq. And yes, clearly there is an opportunity there for.
The big problem I've always had with Kurdistan and with the Kurdish question, as it were, is that where the Kurds want to carve out their nation is a place where other people live as well. Assyrians and Chaldeans, Shiite Muslims and Sunni Muslims, Yazidis, Shabakis. You also have Armenians there. The Kurds are making claim for a region that other people have a claim for. And the thing is that they're making this claim in a very exclusivist manner. It would be one thing if they were saying, we want an independent Kurdistan and we want to include these different groups, in this Kurdistan. And it's going to be parts of Iraq and parts of Turkey going all the way down to like maybe near Kuwait or whatever have you. Maybe that would be understandable. But like the Kurds, this is a very Kurdistan for the Kurds only, right? And that's the problem I've always had with the Kurdistani claims. Is like, it seems like there's no space for these other groups that have been there for like time immemorial. The Kurds are sort of newer to the scene. They're what's it called? They started moving towards the Middle East from Iran, I think about 1,000 years ago or so. I could be wrong on that, but they're not. They aren't as like the Assyrians have been there for like millennia. The Chaldeans millennia. These
Since
are all
time of Noah.
Yeah. Abraham, he was born in Ur of Chaldees.
Yeah, exactly. These are all
That's right.
ancient natives. And absolutely, I think the other issue I think most of you will appreciate is just that sort of neo-nationalist factor as well. So this particular like Middle Eastern nationalism as a way to unite the country, the post-Sykes-Picot mindset. Not saying it's bad. Maybe it is a necessity in the modern world as opposed to, building an emirate or a caliphate, right? With majority Muslim and a minority like Talmudic Jewish and Christian population. But it does come with certain downsides. For example, that idea that, well, we all need to be somewhat mono-ethnic in our nation. And that sort of ethnic cleansing aspect comes into it. I mean, if we look at countries in Africa, that's kind of what's taking place in certain areas. But I do want to mention in the Middle East, specifically the Kurds, what will they be how will they be respecting, again, the minorities, and not even minorities in certain provinces and areas and oblasts, so to speak, sort of transporting a Russian term into the Middle East. How will they be respecting the majorities, right, in some of these areas that they've lived there for so long, they've withstood all this conflict and strife, and yet the Kurds exactly are the newcomers. Yes, they're the ones with the guns now, they're the ones with the power, they have the monopoly on violence, so to speak, but it's up to them to respect the locals, unlike the apparent Israelis, whom all the Middle Easterners sort of have at least slight, I wouldn't say disrespect, but a slight suspicion of, at the very, very least, if not an outright hatred. So if you don't want to act like a Zionist Israeli, you have to respect your neighbors among whom you're living. And I mean, in this case, it's very easy because, well, the majority of the Kurds, 80% plus of them, are Sunni Muslims. They'll be living among primarily Sunni Muslims, so it shouldn't even be a problem. However, yes, there are these like PKK Marxist type attitudes among them, and the secularism, and I guess the secularist aspect is always, I think, slightly dangerous because it does dilute reality to a certain extent. Not to say that an Islamic pathway is the best one for the Middle East at the moment, but yeah, we've spoken about this quite a few times. It's very difficult to even brainstorm a solution. It's not a peace for the Middle East type of cliche solution, but just where exactly to put the Kurds and how exactly to calm down their aspirations for nation. Because again, as you said, Isaac, they are one of the, so to speak, maybe 2 or 3 nations, if you at the moment. I mean, Palestine is recognized by a large majority of the world. However, if you look at the Tuaregs in the Sahel, they're not recognized as, so to speak, as a nation. They don't have a nation state. The Kurds don't have one. And I think if we would speak about sovereignty-wise, Palestine doesn't really have a nation state yet either. These 3 main ethnicities really don't have what other nations have really obtained over the last 100 years. And that is a big sticking point. So until it's resolved, this will be a problem for countries like Syria, Iraq, and maybe even countries like Iran if, God forbid, it's destabilized in the future.
I mean, the Kurdish question is just going to be, at some point, there's going to be, I mean, frankly speaking, either Turkey is going to have to just create a Kurdish autonomous zone on the border with Syria and Iraq, or like the Syria and Iraq are going to have to accept the fact that, their autonomous zone and, northeastern Syria is just that, an autonomous zone.
The way I look at it is, are the Kurds actually sovereign or not? And I don't think they are. Who is funding them? How are they able to do this? I mean, their businesses, essentially, stealing the oil that was Syria's and allowing America to steal oil that was Syria's and selling it to Israeli Jews. A lot of what they will get will be entirely dependent on what kind of priority they're given by America. And there's no way that America is going to prioritize Kurds over Israeli Jews, maybe not even over Ukrainians. So, what are they going to do? What they establish will be largely dependent on what America and Israel are comfortable with. And at the moment, if Erdogan is able to convince them to move to Iraq, that means they're kind of low on the priority because America doesn't want any trouble with Turkey at the moment. And, frankly, I don't know what Turkey can accomplish in Syria or in the Kurdish-controlled areas of Syria. However, I think maybe the big looming question as to what all these machinations may or may not be about is there going to be another war with Iran and Israel? And it won't be 12 days long because essentially that hasn't been resolved yet. And so I don't think even the Kurdish question can be properly addressed until that is accomplished. And I don't know what you guys think. How soon is the possibility of another war between Israel and Iran?
I think maybe by the end of the year. It depends. I mean, the Iranians are continuing their nuclear program. They haven't signed anything with the Americans. They don't want to sign anything with the Americans. And yeah, I think the war will, like end of the year or beginning of next year.
That's exactly right. And we've had those prognoses as well, because even the 12-day war, notice Israel was the one to strike first. So they're going to take the initiative once again. Most likely that, yes, they do probably still have terrorist cells. Yeah, as we unfortunately all know, that these people, they plan ahead. As we know, the whole pager terror strike project that they've essentially planned literally a decade in advance against Hezbollah, but I would say generally against the Lebanese people. As if you look at the number of civilian casualties, etc. But it's very interesting that Israel naturally, because it acts so emotionally, and it's the weird thing, because the Talmud is a very it's not a very emotional book, right? It's very legalistic, and yet the people themselves who adhere to these particular values, they do follow a very emotive, instinctual, almost like animalistic trend of behavior. So as soon as they notice that the US is at least trying to normalize, or perhaps these BRICS nations, right, trying to network with Iran, for example, like India just received a 6-month sanction/tariff exemption on Iran's Kabadkhar port. Now, this is key. This is the second largest port in the Persian Gulf, right, of Iran. And this is the one closer to Pakistan. So India will be able to trade with Iran, 0 issues, no sanctions for the next 6 months. And it received that from the Donald J. Trump administration. So Netanyahu, clearly he can see this. He's receiving these briefs. He can see that not all these countries around the world that apparently even support Israel, like India, for example, like Prime Minister Modi, are interested in this greater Israel, world being engulfed in war, especially the Middle East being destabilized project. I think India wants to compete with its, largest, so to speak, neighbor, China. They just want to grow. They want to lift their population largely into the middle class out of poverty. There's other interesting projects, constructive things that I think the majority of the world wants to be engaged in. They're not interested in the eternal warfare project that I think, as you said, GSP, Israel wants to essentially force not just the region, but the world into in order to construct the third temple and to destroy the Al-Aqsa Mosque, etc. So I think common sense, and we're all made in the image of God, and I think that is always kind of saving us from sort of going too deep into one particular angle of evil. I mean, even the Israelis following, their particular beliefs, sometimes common sense wins over. And that's, I think, the hope for the future. But in any case, what's interesting is we spoke about this boogeyman of Islamism in particular in relation to Hamas and Hezbollah and the rhetoric being used by the Trump administration and by Israel. But where that's kind of striking new chords again is in 2 particular African countries. Now, these countries aren't neighbors, so to speak, but they are more or less in the same region. And both of them, coincidentally, were once essentially fiefdoms, you could say colonies in the classical sense of the British Empire. So Nigeria and Sudan, right? And of course, we remember Sudan because Khartoum, of course, Major General Gordon, his last stand in 1885, you can find the very beautiful painting. And of course, we all know that story. I mean, it's quite a heroic defiance of the jihadis back then by General Gordon, etc. Everybody's heard those sort of legendary escapades of the British colonialists in Africa and how they fought against the natives. But what's taken place, and we'll start with Sudan, I think, very briefly here, because this war has been going on for quite a while. The civil war in Sudan has taken, I think people estimate, at least 250,000 lives in recent years, but probably millions in the last few decades. In fact, it's hard to even keep track. And Sudanese culture is very different. Yeah, it's actually one of the most unspoken about tragedies. And I do have to, despite our, views of Alex Jones and his recent, say, departure from the truth, literally going into certain issues, his coverage of the Tutsi and the Hutu massacre of Rwanda was actually quite interesting, because I think as much as that was unspoken about in the 1990s, the Sudanese issue today is really the equivalent. So we have obviously Christian minorities, and in Sudan, I think the Christian minorities are well and truly in the literally decimal points. There's barely any Christian communities in Sudan. I think it's 98% Muslim, but that doesn't prevent the Sudanese Muslims from slaughtering each other wholesale. And that's A lot of people are saying, oh, well, this is just Islam. They can't get along. But if you look at the actual groups fighting, so the official Sudanese government, as well as the RSF, on paper, at least in theory, and maybe there is a slow transitioning taking place here, but the RSF is not an Islamic organization. It's just a militarized authoritarian. If anything, it's a bit more secular. It's not Janim, it's not Boko Haram, it isn't another branch of ISIS, for example. It is literally just a militarized attack force, very similar to the one we discussed in terms of Mazloum Abdi and the Kurds, right? Who they don't really base their defiance of the rest of Syria, so to speak, the Bashar al-Assad regime or the al-Julani regime on Islam. They base it on this sort of nationalism and militaristic independence. The same goes here. RSF, the Rapid Support Forces that have now taken the new city in North Darfur, El Fasher, have essentially committed further atrocities. And we just have to rely on mainstream sources, and even Russian sources have reported on this, despite the fact that I note that at least before 2023, it does appear that the Wagner Group, for example, maybe collaborated in some way with the RSF, especially just after the coup took place in Sudan. So that when the RSF essentially became one of the potential forces that could have taken power in Sudan, Wagner maybe had some contracts with the RSF, or at least asked them not to engage in, not to touch Wagner interests, that is, some of the gold mines in Sudan. Now, how lucrative these gold mines are, and mineral collection in general, at the moment, it is a bit of an outdated method of wealth accumulation, so to speak. At least if we look at like the AI bubble, and we spoke to a GSP and Isaac off air earlier about how essentially the world economy is just, it's hard to tell exactly where real value is because we're looking at giant numbers. For example, NVIDIA hitting a $5 trillion market cap this week. Like these numbers, that's more than all the minerals gathered in Africa over the last 2 decades, right? So you can't really quantify how effective Wagner's mineral collection has been at this project, or what exactly they're doing in Sudan, if they're still even there. In any case, RSF, they've taken El Fasher. And if you look at a map of Sudan, this is in the southwest of Sudan. And atrocities have ensued. In particular, there was one hospital in El Fasher that was essentially shot up. Now, what the RSF troops were looking for in the hospital, it's unclear. Were they looking for commanders of the official government? Were they looking for traitors? We're not sure, but they essentially went word toward, according to, again, sources on the ground and the World Health Organization, which I know we doubtfully trust, especially after the COVID pandemic. But in any case, they went word toward just killing everyone in the hospital. So 600 plus people just slaughtered, killed. And then there was also mass executions outside of the city, and to the point where there was satellite footage of sand and essentially like splots of brown. You could see bodies. You could see essentially pools of blood visible from low orbit satellites in the sky in the sands of Sudan. So rough stuff really happening here in Sudan at the moment. And I note again that despite all the footage coming out, for example, RSF forces and some of these other small groups issuing Islamic proclamations, Alhamdulillah and Allahu Akbar, like God is great, etc., and thank God, we have to have a sober perspective on this. Sudan has been in a state of civil war really since the end of the colonial period. It's very different when we speak about Nigeria in a moment. It doesn't mean that what the RSF is doing or what the official government forces are doing is excusable at all, especially if I think, and Isaac, maybe you can comment on this, the fact that what appears to be behind the RSF, and sadly, does appear that there are Gulf forces. For example, the UAE is a major sponsor of the Rapid Support Forces, which is strange. A lot of people have begun literally pointing the fingers at Dubai, saying, look, you're basically committing in Sudan what Israel has been committing in Palestine, slaughtering essentially Muslims. For what? For economic gain, for political gain in Sudan, to turn Sudan into this, I guess, Dubai colony somewhere in Africa. It's really atrocious. And I just want to, before I get to you, Isaac, I just want to show the listeners the analogy to Nigeria, because Nigeria, located just to the west of Sudan, it's an entirely different situation going on there. Nigeria, much larger, obviously a bigger population. I believe they have the highest birth rates in the world. Again, a former British colony, as opposed to Niger, which in the north, if you recall, I think maybe even we covered this with you, GSP, in July 2023, Niger had that famous coup, the anti-French coup, because remember, Niger is a French colony, Nigeria was a British colony, and they're, of course, next door neighbors. And Niger joined that whole Burkina Faso, Mali coalition of the Sahel belt, and they're trying to, of course, build up a relationship both with Russia, China, and again, an anti-NATO, essentially, belt in the sort of center north of Africa, which is quite interesting. But Nigeria, since at least the early 2000s, has always been very pro-Western. And the country itself is, despite the huge population, is very divided linguistically, 52 plus languages, 20 plus major ethnic groups. It's not mono-ethnic at all. Very diverse. I mean, many of these big Central African countries are incredibly diverse. So there isn't really unity outside of the secular political model, which the West has installed, that is liberal democracy. So you have your parliamentary representative and you sort of get along with them, but there isn't anything. The country is more or less artificial, almost like a mini Guyana, you can almost say, like in South America next to Venezuela. Not to downplay Nigeria, but Nigeria, the issue there is completely different to Sudan. Sudan is a civil war type situation with civil war style crimes, similar to maybe what we saw in Syria, maybe a decade prior, except much more explicit. And people, it seems, they've almost lost their conscience in Sudan, whereas in Syria, there was always, besides, of course, ISIS, of course, committing heinous war crimes and, of course, terrorist acts as well. In Sudan, it appears that it's just a complete Mad Max type scenario where they just believe that there will be no answering for their crimes if they commit them. There will be no Hague, there will be no, so to speak, Nuremberg trial, etc. In Nigeria, the situation is different. The government has more or less stabilized the situation, except in the northeastern corner of Nigeria, where the jungle and the desert sort of intersect three different countries of Niger, Nigeria, and Chad. And there you have this group called Boko Haram, which we've all heard about. Essentially, it's just black ISIS. I think that's the best way to describe it. This is a non-Arab, black African Islamic group, which has essentially, it goes back to collaborating with al-Qaeda back in the day, somewhat working with the Taliban as well. But it's essentially a prototypical ISIS. And this particular group has been killing Christians in somewhere around 2,000 to 5,000 local Christians in that jungle desert region of northeastern Nigeria for years. Every single year, at least 1,000 Christians are killed. Extrajudicially, obviously, they're beheaded, etc. So the Christians that are killed in Nigeria are essentially, you have Catholics reporting on it, Orthodox Christians reporting on it. There's a lot of information about it available. And yet now we have finally the Trump administration. Now that, the eyes need to be taken off of Gaza and Palestine and what the Talmudic Zionists have been doing, now they're pointing the fingers at Nigeria saying, wow, look, that's Islamic terror. It's like that we found a new point of interest. It's like, hold on, that has been happening for a long time now. You've not reacted at all. And suddenly the Trump administration wants to now say that, put blame on the Nigerian government for them not acting fast enough when, frankly, Trump could have acted on the Nigerian Boko Haram issue back in 2017 or 18 instead of procuring and creating the Ukrainian schism or wasting his time elsewhere. So just in general, I think there's great agitation, and I'll go to you first, Isaac. In Africa, I think this is, the world really has become a super complicated place. You have Sudan, it's one style of conflict, generally speaking, non-Islamic in nature, but you will probably have these Islamic terror groups taking advantage of the instability. And UAE, generally speaking, Dubai, their interests are maybe similar to how Doha, the Qataris, what they pursued in Syria. Now they have essentially a pocket government in the face of al-Julani. I think UAE, Dubai are looking for their own neo-colonial Arabist ventures in Sudan and the whole Nigeria
that
thing.
way. See it that way. The Israelis also have something of a relationship with the RSF forces. They came in 2022. Israeli military and Mossad officials visited the RSF in Sudan before the civil war kicked off. The UAE is sponsoring this, and it's frankly very it's incredibly gross. I've seen some of the footage coming out of Sudan, and it's I don't like it. I don't like it at all. There's this one video I saw of a woman with her 3 children on the ground, and this RSF man was I guess like scaring her and threatening to kill her and the children. And I guess like pointing the weapon at her. And it was like, it's, I don't know what to make of it. I'm not even sure the RSF are even really actually Arabist or even really like, they're supposed to be quote unquote anti-Islamic and quote unquote they're supposed to be quote unquote Arab nationalists, but I think this is more all about like personal power, because my understanding is, and Goran or Dmitry, correct me if I'm wrong, the RSF are basically a continuation of the old Janjaweed militias that the Sudanese government would use whenever they need to put down rebellions or to expand territory, especially when it came to Darfur and southern Sudan in the 80s and the 90s. And the RSF was officially formed in August of 2013. And I think it was always a matter that they never really just, they're a paramilitary group that never got along with the government. And now they see an opportunity probably to just take over, take control. The current government in Sudan, I mean, I'm not entirely sure what kind of relationship it has with Israel or its relationship with Palestinians or Palestinian resistance, as it were, or just larger Middle Eastern resistance to, Israel in the West. But it's very obvious that the UAE, it seems that the RSF has an alignment towards Israel, and the UAE might be wanting to take advantage of that at the very least to see, okay, if I can fund the RSF, then basically I can control Sudan, right? In the hopes that the RSF is successful in ultimately taking over the capital, Khartoum, because there was a time for a bit when they took over the capital, but then the Sudanese army was able to drive them out. But no, just the slaughter and the massacre has just been absolutely terrible. Absolutely terrible. I hate it. In terms of Nigeria, this is also just a really miserable thing that's happening. Nigeria is about half Muslim, half Christian. The northern states are Muslim. The northern provinces are Muslim. Southern states are Christian. Northern provinces the northern Muslim majority provinces have enacted Sharia law in some form or another, where Islamic law is part of the actual civil law. The Christians in those regions are being persecuted. And it's just a matter of the government both can't take control of the situation, and in certain cases, I'm not even sure they care enough to take control of the situation. The problem is that Trump says he wants to bomb these targets in Nigeria. I'm like, okay, where were you? Where were you when HTS was slaughtering Alawites and Christians on the coast? Where have you been for Syria? In fact, if anything, you basically, we know where you were. You let it happen because, because you supported al-Julani. And yeah, JD Vance came up with a tweet, condemning it. But, oh, this is what happens when you get yourself involved. I'm like, oh, so you tweeted about this, about how bad it is. But, this government was involved in all of this. The Trump administration was involved in this. And then the Biden administration and the Trump administration essentially continued the policy of being involved in this. And I mean, I don't know. I hate it. I hate seeing it. I think as a Palestinian in particular, seeing what's happening in Sudan and seeing what's happening in Nigeria, all I have to say is, MashaAllah, look at the fruits of the Ummah. I'm really, really just done with the Ummah and its inability. And you're right. We're talking about this calculating, pragmatic, frankly, cowardly attitude that they take. They seem to be more than willing to, kill defenseless people. But Israel, nobody wants to touch Israel. Nobody wants to attack the actual sore in the Middle East, right? The open wound in the Middle East that prevents any real or serious unification of Arabs as a whole or real peace prospects in the future. No, let's go kill Christians in Nigeria. Let's slaughter women and children in Sudan. Let's kill Alawites and Christians in Shia and Yazidi in Syria and Iraq. Let's bomb churches in Egypt. It's just, in the 90s, all the Chechens, let's go, how many Chechens went into Bosnia to do jihad? How many Chechens went to Bosnia to do jihad? Where are these Chechens? So where are they? What's it called? It's interesting how the Chechens haven't managed to smuggle themselves into the West Bank.
Yeah. It reveals this kind of futility, right? Like they're setting up a world where they are going to lose the Al-Aqsa Mosque because of their inability to deal with Israel. And Israel, in many ways, is rubbing this in their face. Israel is doing their own kind of, let's say, Talmudic magic. On the one hand, they know fully well that Israel is bombing and killing women and children in tents, right? Remember, they would say, evacuate this area and go to that other area down south, and you'll receive, food and shelter and water there. And then they would bomb them as they went. I remember that happening weeks after October the 7th, right? And so the Israelis know this, and like now there's always a level, there's a fine line where they know, and at the same time, they know they can claim plausible deniability, mistakes in target acquisition, yada, yada, yada. But ultimately they know, and ultimately they want your complicity in knowing that what they are doing. It's a kind of sanction to do that. And because they'll never receive any kind of payback for it, there'll be no justice for their actions, right? You see that like Sunni Muslims are doing the same thing, but against weaker groups. al-Julani knows that if he kills Christians and Alawites and Shia in Syria, nothing will happen. And it's the same thing with these Muslim groups in Africa. They know they won't. And so, and there is a complicity in so much as they know that the footage is being shared, sometimes by their own men. But the Ukrainians were like this in the beginning as well in their war. They know that they will not be brought to justice for their crimes. And so all these groups associated with the US are involved in this kind of Talmudism, in this kind of ritualistic killing, and this kind of gleeful celebration of committing crimes that they know that they, won't be tried for.
No, that's exactly right. And as we cover the African issue, our hope is that the world doesn't really, impact these particular areas as badly. And clearly, the armaments in Africa, they are very small in terms of missiles, air defense systems, things of this nature. So when the world, if, and I think on the show we talk about almost the inevitability of the Third World War becoming hot in the near future, unfortunately due to some of the bad decisions being made by the politicians and clearly the various military industrial complexes in a lot of these countries are, essentially arming themselves for an inevitable conflict. And too many people are noticing, so to speak, noticing the real wise elders behind the scenes. And so things need to be cleansed and exchanged. And we always discuss the risks that this may have, not just on the countries involved in that fight, but just by collateral in Africa. What will happen, the famines that will ensue, the logistics lines that will be broken, and the potential, these groups that will emerge. Unfortunately, yes, the Syria scenario is very similar to what's plaguing Sudan at the moment, albeit with much less coverage. And clearly in Sudan, the violence, as Isaac mentioned earlier, is just absolutely horrendous. It's explicit. And maybe this is what's in some part inspiring some of the Zionists in the West Bank as well, as to what they're committing with animals and humans as well. It's just quite cruel. A lot of cruelty being done this week around the world. But without further ado, I think it's time to move on to a battlefront, which we've been covering, and frankly, GSP, you've been covering on the War Report on a weekly and even fortnightly basis in huge amounts of detail, in particular, the Russo-Ukrainian war. And I'll just give a brief overview as to what's been happening over the last week to 10 days or so, because it's been absolutely huge. So the Russians, as we've been covering with Conrad on World War Now quite a bit, they've been progressing steadily and essentially without any issue westwards through the Donetsk Oblast. Those particular areas still held by Ukraine. Ukraine holds probably less than 5,000 kilometers squared now in the Donetsk Oblast proper. So they're reducing, of course, their territorial claims that they've had since 2014, since the civil war ensued. And the Russians have finally, it seems, almost closed off the entirety of Pokrovsk, not just of course, the surround on the city, but the actual city interior itself is being hollowed out. And officially there's been, and as you'll I think note, GSP, there's been no official order by the commander-in-chief Syrsky of the Ukrainian forces for a retreat. And it's absolutely insane. The Ukrainians, well, if we're very conservative here, the Ukrainian armed forces have lost, and I'm being very conservative, at least 10,000 soldiers in Pokrovsk alone. Most likely more, based on just the sheer numbers. We know both sides had at least 100,000 soldiers on either sides of the city months ago. Probably, Zelensky claimed the Russians were outnumbering the Ukrainians 6-1, but that's absolutely false. Both sides actually had an equal number of troops. It's just, yes, the Russians had more artillery, and both sides had tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of drones, as we know. So the losses of life are absolutely enormous. Pokrovsk is well and truly falling, and we can see footage of that all over the internet. Even you'll see official Ukrainian media channels now beginning to cope. All right, the copium is being smoked, it's being inhaled, they're drinking it. They're trying to bring up reasons. Oh, well, Pokrovsk wasn't actually strategically important for us anyway. It's like, wait a minute, wasn't Zelensky there for a photo shoot a couple of months ago? No, that doesn't matter anymore, apparently. And the Azov battalion, as like the Grim Reaper, as I've said off air, has arrived in Pokrovsk. So it's Azov is active on the ground, just like in Avdiivka in 2024. And that's a sign that the city is well and truly going to fall. And, if we're being conservative, it's going to fall before 2026. And I think, as GSP and Isaac have said earlier off air, there's a good chance the Russians will actually take this major city within the next month, if not weeks. So the progress is absolutely astounding. So the Russians are really pushing Zelensky's regime to the limits, seeing how much pressure they can take. And at the same time, that same pressure is being applied to those funding the Zelensky regime. And those same forces that have been promoting Israeli Zionism, that is NATO, the West, the UK, primarily in Ukraine, but also that unfortunately the Trump administration has been heavily involved in sort of at least morally and rhetorically somewhat supporting Zelensky and giving mixed messages and not really pushing for real peace by forcing Zelensky to sit at the negotiating table and not putting forward these stupid claims that he wants to retake Crimea and other ludicrous propositions. And every single day, from what I'm reading, Oleg Tsarev has been informing us that at least 150 Ukrainian drones are being shot down every single day. And that's the drones that are being shot down by Russian air defense.
Staggering.
So every week, thousands of drones are being shot down. I'm assuming a certain percentage are also successfully hitting their targets. So that's hundreds of drones launched every single day by Ukraine, likewise by Russia. And the war has reached its peaking right now. Fortunately, I think for many reasonable people around the world, and I think for Christians in general, the Russians are winning so far. So GSP, if you can give us your war report special, so to speak, for our dear listeners here.
Sure. Sure. Why don't we begin with Pokrovsk? Before I do, I'll touch on what you've just said about drone strikes. Both the Russians and the Ukrainians, respectively, have been targeting each other's oil refinery stations and power stations. There's been several articles, the Wall Street Journal, the New York Times, the Independent in the UK, citing, Kiev is in the dark. That's been throughout all of October. But the Ukrainians have also struck, for instance, they struck in an area of Kursk. The substation was destroyed, not destroyed, but it was targeted. Lights did go out in part of the city. And then in Krasnodar region in southern Russia, one of the oil refineries was hit yesterday. But Russians, of course, have been doing this on a slightly larger scale. And yesterday night was no different, with hits in Odessa, Kiev, Poltava, Kharkov, many places, Sumy, Chernigov, etc. As far as the front lines, so there's some interesting developments. We'll begin with Pokrovsk. Pokrovsk right now, 80% of Pokrovsk is under Russian control, if not more. Based on the maps that I was looking at very early this morning, What I see is the last of the apartment complexes in the northeastern part of Pokrovsk have been taken. This is not the most northern part of Pokrovsk, but most of the other areas are residential north of this area. The industrial zones, the train station are taken. There was an industrial zone that was taken in the early part of the week. This is important because it has cut off virtually anything. I believe it's Griske or Griske. That's a town northwest of Pokrovsk, right? But basically what the Russians have done in the last 2 weeks is they've managed to take Rodinske. Now, Rodinske is directly north of Mirnograd. So I'm sorry, I'm going to give you the Southern Slavic pronunciation. If we see a G, we're going to say it as a G, not an H.
No, GSP, that is the correct way, actually. The H is a complete, unfortunately, I'll just call it what it is. It's a Polish-Ukrainian innovation. So the G is correct, absolutely.
Poñil. So Mirnograd Rodinske is just north of Mirnograd. If you take these three towns or townships, if you will, I mean, Mirnograd and Pokrovsk are actual small cities, but the total is about 110,000 people before the war. So it's a sizable area. Definitely, it's more dense and even harder to fight through than a town like Bakhmut was, or Avdiivka, like almost twice the magnitude. We're now in an area that's even bigger than Mariupol was. So it has been a difficult fight, including for the Russians, to finally achieve this. One of the things that the Russians have been able to do is that if things aren't going well in Pokrovsk, what the Russians will do then is step up attacks towards Liman, Siversk, or fight and overtake the double belt of defense lines that the Ukrainians have built since the summer of 2023 in the Zaporozhye and Dnepropetrovsk region. So that is essentially what they're doing, and they've kind of forced the Ukrainians to decide on, how much are they going to give up in other areas in order to defend Pokrovsk. Another area where this is happening is in Kupyansk. Kupyansk, the entire western section of Kupyansk, because of course, Kupyansk is a small city that is divided in two, but the Oskal River is under Russian control. Earlier in the week, there was a Russian incursion that went over the river, established themselves in a kind of mix of residential and institutional buildings that offered some amount of shelter. And then this morning, what I saw was that the area directly northeast of Kupyansk, much of it is open field, but there are some residential buildings in the southern part of this pocket. It has collapsed. It was in a no man's zone for at least a week or two. And now that's under Russian control. So honestly, I'm expecting Kupyansk to fall before Mirnograd. And I'm probably thinking that Mirnograd and Kupyansk will fall before the end of November. The Ukrainians made some attempts to stem the progress that the Russians had developed, especially in October. October saw an average gain of 16.5 square kilometers a day, mostly in Donetsk. Much of that is true in September. Much of that is true in October, except the figure went to 18.9. Again, mostly in Donetsk. No change in Lugansk, about 150 to 170 square kilometers in the Zaporozhye region. And in the Dnepropetrovsk region, they controlled 1% there. And of course, around Kupyansk, which is part of the Kharkov Oblast, the Russians have about 5% of that area. The Russians have also crossed over into some of the islands. Mm-hmm. This trend started about 2.5 weeks ago. And I didn't know what to think of it. But now there is an Ostrov in the southern part of Kherson that is quite built up. It has industrial complexes and it has apartment buildings, and a lot of them, and the kind that were built during the Soviet era, which are very robust and resistant towards bombing. And it looks like the Russian RDG units are in this area. So that's a lot of progress that I honestly didn't know whether they were even going to bother. But I think the Russians, if I could use it as a summary, I think the Russians can sense a collapse is coming. I think they know that the Western plan did not include a kind of a withdrawal to the Dnieper River and, let's say, fortify cities like the Dnieper city or Zaporozhye city. Like, they would have been, they're even bigger cities. They would have been difficult to take. You could, but they didn't want to lose this land under any conditions. Mm-hmm. And a lot of this has to deal with investment. There's a lot of people in the West who have all kinds of investment money that was promised to them on the basis that Russia would be defeated. And that, these so-called rare earth minerals, it's all about extraction. Lots of countries actually have rare earth minerals. It's about the processing and extraction. That's really 9/10 of the issue with rare earths, and the difficulty of acquiring and refining them. So I would say Pokrovsk, Leningrad, like there is a small part in the south where Russians have incurred. There's also some forest lines in the south of the city that are technically not part of the city that the Russians have taken. But I'm telling you, 80 to 85% of Pokrovsk is already under Russian control. And what that does is it allows them to funnel in supplies that are, they're not safe. They're in less danger of Ukrainian drone attacks than they were, let's say, a month or 2 months ago. Mm-hmm. Is what I'll say about that. And of course, Seversk and Liman, the Russians gained tons of territory in that forest belt on the border of Donetsk and Lugansk. And they are on the outskirts of southern Liman. This happened after the Russians took over one of the two northern roads. Now, the second northern road leading into Liman for resupplies is under drone attack. And the Ukrainians have tried to, I forget the name of the town that is in the southern part of this forest belt near the Severodonetsk River. They sent in several vehicles. All of them were hit. And now there is fighting not just between FPV units, but also men on the ground. So very bloody battle in an area about halfway situated between Liman and Seversk. And with that, I will say is the frontline minute.
No, that's perfect. And before I sort of transition to your thoughts, Isaac, about just Europe in general and where Zelensky's escapades, and it's not just Zelensky, he's just a figurehead at them, but this particular Talmudic plan to destabilize all of Europe via Ukraine, where all this originated from, and essentially almost prompted us to enter into the Third World War a lot earlier than I think everybody was ready for it. I do want to mention that this week we did have some fairly big news out of Russia, and many people are judging this from different perspectives, but Putin did officially announce, and there was footage provided of essentially a Russian nuclear-powered cruise missile, the Burevestnik, essentially 9M730 missile. So what's different? What is the point? There's a lot of different cruise missiles. America produces them, etc. Well, this is the first nuclear-based cruise missile, which doesn't necessarily, of course, the point of this Burevestnik test was that, well, the missile itself would have a nuclear warhead equipped to it. But in the testing, there wasn't an actual nuclear warhead. They were simply flying the missile body itself, seeing how well it could maneuver. Apparently, then this is quite impressive. And I think for the future, literally the future of mankind, and potentially even Rosatom assisted in developing this particular technology, it's equivalent to the change that took place in the 20th century when they began installing small independent nuclear reactors on naval submarines, which allowed essentially the submarines to remain underwater for huge, prolonged periods of time. The Burevestnik is a cruise missile with a mini nuclear reactor that, and by the way, no Western source, no Russian source has of yet announced that they've sort of scanned any sort of nuclear particles or the nuclear energy sort of released inside of this Burevestnik missile does not actually leave the missile itself. There's zero pollution from it. There's zero detectability. The missile itself essentially flies through low orbit for a prolonged period of time. At least the test was a duration of 15 hours. So you almost have essentially a missile, which is in the style of a Reaper drone or a plane, flies even higher than that. And it functions almost like a sky submarine, I want to say. But of course, this is unmanned. So this particular missile is able to land anywhere. It's obviously cross-continental, and it can land and hit its particular target. This is apparently supposed to potentially deter NATO into the future, given that Russia's ability to strike. And I mean, this is a new form of technology, a new form of nuclear missile, which no other nation seems to possess at this point in time. And I think the biggest point is not the fact that it's, well, a new way for humanity to blow each other up, but the ability of Russians, and they've done this in the past. And if you remember in 2018, this was a very, very small story, but Putin in 2018 said that, well, Russia will be launching satellites into low orbit and some into high orbit, which will have small nuclear reactors inside of them, right? Which will help with energy generation. And apparently people saw this as critical because they're like, hold on, well, it's fine putting nuclear reactors inside of naval submarines because, well, if something happens, then the contagion will be essentially locked up underwater somewhere, right? But what if a mini Chernobyl reactor falls down onto the earth? That's obviously an issue. Many people were making fun of Putin in 2018 for saying this. A lot of even Russian journalists were saying this is incredibly dangerous, having a flying nuclear reactor in the sky. I mean, but the Russians, it seems they've gone ahead and they've actually created essentially a missile-based nuclear reactor system, which will allow essentially these cruise missiles to fly, maneuver, pinpoint a correct target on the ground and definitely strike. It's very innovative. And just in general, we know this won't be deterring the West. Like, they know that Russia won't be using this in Ukraine, most likely. But in terms of a futuristic technological development, this is, again, another sort of boon, I think, for Russia. And it's amazing that even under such sanctions, Russia's able to develop such technology in such a short amount of time. Literally, it's been 7 years or so since that mini aerial nuclear reactor announcement by President Putin. So impressive. And of course, the Poseidon, again, announcement, the Poseidon nuclear torpedoes. And again, this is very World War III-esque, were again announced by Putin. And the Khabarovsk nuclear submarine, Andrei Belousov, the Russian Minister of Defense, that he saw the christening of that, a champagne bottle was broken against the hull of this big Khabarovsk nuclear submarine. Apparently, it will be able to carry 12 of these Poseidon nuclear missiles on board, torpedoes, that is. So that's quite interesting. Again, the naval warfare is an interesting aspect of, I think, warfare in general. We clearly saw that against the Yemeni Houthis. We saw the American Navy move in almost into the Persian Gulf to confront Iran. We see that with Venezuela today. Naval warfare clearly has stagnated somewhat, and many people are critical of aircraft carriers, submarines. What exactly is their capacity to wage warfare? However, new technology is being developed. There are literally drone torpedoes being made, right? We saw, like, Russia this week has destroyed 5 of them in the Black Sea. So technology continues to develop, and Russia is not falling behind. It's one of the main industries of the Russian Federation, which it fortunately inherited from the Soviet Union, and the Soviet Union likewise inherited from the Russian Empire, which it did not collapse between those transitions. If anything, it strengthened and built up upon what its predecessor has invested into. So quite incredible. Isaac, I just wanted to have any of your thoughts about the entire Zelensky-Ukraine situation, because I think just in general, Zelensky is one of these figureheads that not only does he travel, meets with kings, presidents, sheikhs, emirs, but he provides just a massive distraction. I think generally no one's paying attention to migration politics. No one's paying attention to the reality on the ground, that things are looking bad economically as well speaking. And Zelensky is that clown that maybe we can shift the blame onto when things go south in Russia, Ukraine. I think even from an American perspective, it's absolutely horrendous that we've allowed this nobody, this literally comedy type actor, like this guy has less qualifications than Kamala Harris, right, to run for any presidency. Yeah. And yet, it's a real mark of shame, I think, on literally Western civilization.
Very much so. I think it's very obvious that Zelensky is not really in charge. I think it's Budanov in charge. And I think the state is basically being held together by Budanov, the SBU, and by these right-wing neo-national socialist militias like Pravi Sector and the types. And Azov's involved, but Azov is involved in the front lines right now in Pokrovsk. And what's the saying? Whenever Azov gets involved, the battle is over. I think Pokrovsk has lost. Like Syrskyi, my understanding is trying to push he's as many men that he's taking from Sumy and Chernigov and Kharkov. He's trying to put them into Pokrovsk. He is, I guess, trying to just put more men to be boiled into this cauldron. My understanding is that there's basically two directions he wants to attack from. I'm not entirely sure how successful he'll be. I'm doubtful he'll be successful. The Russians have about 30,000 men in the region. Sorry, in the Pokrovsk area, and obviously they can easily draw more and more men if they need to, because with Pokrovsk they want to avoid another grinding situation like we saw in Bakhmut. But I think that at some point what's going to happen is that when the battle is over, Syrskyi is going to be blamed for it, because I think what's happening is that Syrskyi is lying to Zelensky about how bad it is. He's not telling him the truth. And eventually, Zelensky is just going to have Syrskyi removed, and Syrskyi will go to London, and he will join Zaluzhny in exile there, essentially. And slowly but surely, the Ukrainian defenses in that whole ring, as it were, of Soviet-style post-World War II fortress cities are going to be ground down. And once Konstantinovka and Kupyansk and Slovyansk, right, and Pokrovsk, once those cities and those and a couple others, once they're gone, there's nothing between the Russians and Poltava or Kherson or even Kharkov. I mean, the Russians can just push deep and deep into central Ukraine and then essentially just push into Kiev if they wanted to, which I think they might. I hope they do. I think, GSP, if there's something, I hope my analysis is correct.
Yeah, I agree with you. There's a small ring of three important, well, let's say four important cities. You start from the north with Kharkov, Poltava, Dnipro, and then Zaporozhye. And they're, especially the last two, are right on the Dnipro River. And there isn't anything really in the way in terms of fortifications by the Ukrainians. There are some. They started building them months ago in 2025 and late 2024. I think they knew that this situation was going to go the way it was going. They wanted to make it as costly as possible. Now, just returning briefly to Pokrovsk, if you look at where all the major fortifications are, they are in Donetsk and, Lugansk. Yes, there are many in Zaporozhye, but they came well after the war had started. The thing about Pokrovsk is it is definitely west of the major fortifications that were constructed since 2014 by the Ukrainians. And so that essentially what this will do, Pokrovsk will be a hub to attack these fortifications from the west, from the rear, instead of head on. And it'll create like a pincer movement when the time comes to deal with Seversk, Kramatorsk, Slavyansk, and Konstantinovka. The Russians have also started incurring into Konstantinovka again, and the southern pocket has collapsed south of Konstantinovka. So that's the whole point of that. But we can say that the Russians are actually serious about Kherson. The Ukrainians might be thinking that eventually the West will go in. And I think that the latest Missle technology that Dmitry described, the Burevestnik, I think that our armament is really about what happens after Ukraine or when Ukraine sees Western involvement.
Mm-hmm.
I think that's what it's there for, is if it escalates or there's a new theater that opens up. Canada, for instance, said that it wants to now increase its military might from 28,000 men to over 200,000 men. right? Which is it's huge. God, we'll see. We'll see.
Mm.
We'll see. We'll see if they can manage.
I think the big question becomes at some point, like, how loyal will these paramilitary forces be to Zelensky? Like, at some point, these Azov guys are going to wonder, is teaming up with this Jew and his Jewish friends really good for me and Ukraine as a whole? And I think, will we see a time where essentially as Ukraine falls more and more to Russia, will Zelensky just see an opportunity to flee and create a quote unquote government in exile? Or will he just be straight up ousted by the neo-Nazi, by Azov and by Right Sector and these groups? I'm not even entirely sure what half of them are doing. I know Azov is now involved in Pokrovsk, but generally speaking, they seem to just spend their time in Kiev, just enforcing Zelensky's rule, or just doing what Budnov tells them. I'm not even sure what their relationship is anymore.
Yeah, mostly propaganda, exactly, and recruitment ads, for example, for recruitment ads. And I think they also understand the helplessness of the situation in the East. And look, they, as people with experience, and I'm not trying to sort of glorify them or call them cowards in any way, either left or right, but these people understand the war in the East. This is basically the battle of, this is a World War I style scenario where waves of humans were sent at each other, equivalent to what was happening on the Western Front. And they don't want to be involved in that. And so they're trying to use any excuse possible to not be sent into those meat grinder waves that, as you see yourself, Chief of the Ukrainian Army, Syrskyi, is utilizing so effectively for himself. I'm not sure he considers it effective at this point. At least all the reports we've received literally until about mid-October have been in favor of Ukraine. So, but the media lies to us. I know it's surprising, isn't it? Especially Ukrainian media.
I mean, I think with the Ukrainians, they have this idea that the real Ukraine is still Western Ukraine, and that the amount of Western Ukrainian lives must be preserved. And all those people, south of Kiev, which is central basically, and just slightly on the other side of the Dnieper River, Kryvyi Rog, like those populations are expendable, but they're not as pure Ukrainian as they are. And I do think like that is a strategy where they cannot afford to lose as many true Ukrainians as the other lesser Ukrainians. And that's really for the long haul, because I don't think these people will never stop supporting Zelensky, because Zelensky still represents American interests in Ukraine. And Zelensky is not in a hurry to switch sides. He's not going to do that. It's too late. He would completely discredit himself. So it's only a collapse that would bring about his end. And we might be nearing it. We finally might be there, because really Pokrovsk is 2025 in a way proved that the offensive that Russia started at the end of October 2023 has not stopped. Even though it's been gradual, they've gained thousands of square kilometers each year.
And I have one more question I want to ask. My understanding is that basically the Europeans, and I want to make, and if I am wrong, please correct me, but the Europeans have made it clear that they have no more money, no more money to give Zelensky. They have enough money to fund the government up until like spring 2026. And that's it. That's what I heard. I think the Europeans literally have nothing else to give the Ukrainians. And I think it's so strange watching the Europeans sort of slowly distance themselves from the project while the Americans are going all in by apparently Trump wants to give them tomahawks or something.
I always thought that Trump, the whole tomahawk thing was always like a carrot and stick that he was offering when things weren't going correct, in Ukraine. I mean, I guess he was really naive to think that Russia was going to somehow stop because he asked them to. I think Russia is fully aware that this war isn't going to stop with Ukraine, that the Europeans would be glad to resume this war in 5 years. I'm sure they have like the news packets for, that'll precede, let's say, a conflict that might restart in 2030 or 2028. I mean, it depends. Of course, it depends on what happens in the Middle East. I think in many ways that Hamas didn't do what it did do what it did because it saw weakness, by the West with regards to Ukraine.
Mm,
I think it's a factor. I think
no.
it played a role. I don't think it's what pushed them to do it, but I think they saw it as an opportune time. Now, as Isaac has pointed out, there is a kind of tactical defeat in so much as all the leadership of Hezbollah and Iran has occurred since then, but Israel still hasn't accomplished exactly what it wanted, and I think it wanted it done this year. And their frustration is always about not getting what they want when they want it.
Absolutely. Really appreciate all the input in relation to geopolitics, Isaac and GSB, that you've provided us this week. I think the audience will really appreciate it. I'll just briefly give the church news, which isn't very large this week or voluminous, so to speak, but there is some unfortunate news, which shouldn't really surprise us because Ukraine has been persecuting the church. Now, we mentioned earlier in the Middle East, there are Christian casualties almost on a weekly basis. Clearly in Africa, there's persecution taking place. But in Ukraine, at least on a legalistic level, they are still going after Christian bishops in open court. As we know, Metropolitan Arsenius of the Svyatogorsk monastery and the Russian forces are standing 10, 11 kilometers just to the northeast of his monastery in the Svyatogorsk Lavra, whilst, of course, Metropolitan Arsenius himself is in the city of Dnipro, currently being tried. His trial, at least one of the trial dates, was on the 31st of October, and his charges were actually removed, and he was almost allowed to leave the courtroom until the SBU, the Ukrainian, essentially FBI, showed up, handcuffed him, and took him to a different jail cell, and now he'll be, again, put through a new ringer of criminal trials. I mean, the entire legal system in Ukraine is so corrupted. So Metropolitan Arsenius, one of the, I suppose, not even super pro-Russian metropolitans, but he's always been very neutral, balanced, and just a conservative, very good bishop, is being essentially psychologically tortured through this process. And we know he collapsed on one of the previous trials this year, but just in general, he's been essentially imprisoned since April of 2024. So yeah, well over a year now. And it's just very unfortunate. One of the many persecuted bishops in Ukraine. The other bishop that also had a trial this week from the Cherkasy, the other bishop that had a major trial this week, of course, was from Western Ukraine, Metropolitan Longin of the Banshen Monastery. He had a court hearing. I believe it was just a short hearing, which he attended. And unfortunately, just after the hearing, because we know he has heart problems, he actually had open heart surgery just a few months ago. He again collapsed and needed medical assistance after the hearing. So these bishops are put through it. And just the general picture in Ukraine at the moment, you may be asking, well, why is the Ukrainian government really cracking down on the church at the moment? Well, they're trying to put on a human face before their European neighbors and sponsors, in particular because the official church structure, and Ukraine doesn't really have like an official church organization, so to speak, that's controlling everything top down. That is, Metropolitan Onufry doesn't actually have a registered body that governs the 20,000 plus parishes and church communities around Ukraine. They just, on a religious, spiritual level, they all obey him, but legally speaking, the Ukrainian Orthodox Church is sort of its own business organization based out of Kiev, so to speak, in a legal sense. And that particular primary central church is now appealing their sentence for essentially legality, right? As we know, the Ukrainian government literally banned the church earlier this year. And of course, Metropolitan Onufry was, and rightfully so, and Metropolitan Anthony Polkanich, his right-hand man, essentially the secretary of the Ukrainian Orthodox Church, the autonomous church, he basically took this to the Court of Appeal in Ukraine. So at the moment, they're undergoing essentially their final round of hearings. If successful, the Ukrainian Orthodox Church will regain their legality, which will be good. On paper, at least, the parishes will remain to function. There will be probably reviews of some of the other seizures we saw earlier this year, and I mean throughout the entire SMO process. But as we understand, this is basically just the spiritual side to the special military operation, which is very important to cover because we probably understand that behind the scenes, this is maybe what the enemies of mankind care for the most. How many Christians can they impact negatively through this conflict? And I think promoting it from the beginning of the Maidan coup, right? The fact that it wasn't Christians who conducted it in the first place, I think already raises a lot of eyebrows and puts a lot of this content into suspicion as to it's hard to be a pious church-going Christian, right? Or even a Christian who's striving to be a better person, right? Not to even claim any of us are pious here, and to somehow support the Ukrainian government in its actions. It's really just impossible. So these bishops are undergoing hearings, trials. There's obviously Orthodox Christians dying on the front lines themselves. And we just have to ask who benefits from all of this. So I guess with those particular notes, I do want to note that we will have a great live stream coming up this week. Myself, Conrad, discussing Gabriel the Russian, discussing Orthodox Christian monarchy, the future of Russia, the SMO zone, some of the veterans, and exactly what Conrad has seen. Stay tuned, follow that. And I do want to plug, this is very important actually, because this product I use myself. I've ordered a few books from here. And in fact, if you have any based friends and you want to give them a Christmas present, maybe it's time to start setting some money aside, because we have our first sponsor, Antelope Hill Publishing, right? Which we all know. You can just visit Antelope.
That's great.
Antelope Hill, yeah, publishing.com. If you use the code WWN World War Now, basically, you'll receive 10% off of all of your orders. Of course, myself and Conrad will be supported. Some of the other colleagues behind the scenes who do work for us. In any case, you will be able to obtain paperback.
That is absolutely wonderful. I just want to say real quick, for anyone who buys from Antelope Hill, definitely check out Josh Neal's books, Intolerant Interpretations. Wonderful book by a wonderful...
He's great. He really is.
He's also a very good friend of mine, so I like to help him out.
Wow.
Yeah, I know. And we can get paperback copies of books, which really, I don't know who else will really publish them. Really, it's a small list of places, but Konstantin Rodzaevsky, Alexander Nichvolodov, for example, Scott Howard, David Irving, etc. I mean, the list of authors, historians, cultural analysts, politologists, etc. The list is very long. And for our dear listeners who would like to follow yourself, GSP, from the War Report, Isaac, plug away your links, GSP first, Isaac thereafter, and just let us know where we could find you and where our dear audience can follow some of your progress, and we'll definitely have you on for further shows into the future. I appreciate your time, gentlemen.
It's always a pleasure to record with you, gents. As you know, I am a co-host of the War Report on Constantine Martelli's channel. Constantine Martelli is the name of the channel if you want to take a look at that. We'll be recording this sometime this week. Constantine was busy this weekend. So I'll spell it for you. It's CONSTANTINE space MARTELLI. Constantine Martelli on YouTube.
You can find me on Twitter. If you want to find me, you can find me at, let's see, what is my @ real quick? Sometimes I forget it. It's at @meth_slonker, based meth addict. That's what I go by. You can also find my blog on Substack, the Unending Catastrophe.substack.com. It's where I'm trying to finish my podcast. It's just so much work I do. I'm out here waging like an animal, like a slave in my cage, as it were, 50, 60 hours a week. Makes life hard, but you can subscribe there, subscribe for free, or if you want to donate, that's greatly appreciated. And yes, so my Twitter account is at meth_slonker.com, and my Substack is the unendingcatastrophe.substack.com.
Wonderful. And you know where to follow the World War Now podcast if you would like some alternatives. If you're listening on YouTube or Spotify, Apple, We have, of course, Rumble available as well for you. X, some people like to listen on the former Twitter app as well. Check us out there. Follow Conrad Franz at GnomeRad on X. Follow myself at World War Now Host. Of course, follow at World War Now _ on X. Most importantly, though, subscribe, follow the Substack, because that's where I guess all the highest quality content is released. First and foremost, in the direct instance for you, this is where we have the interviews coming out. We'll have the great podcast and live coverage as well, releasing very, very soon. If I say exciting content, it will sound like a cliche, but really I'm excited myself as to what we have coming up. So thank you, gentlemen, for covering all of this. Yeah, it's been an amazing week in terms of coverage and news. Thank you for lining it all up, categorizing it for me as well. So I appreciate all the assistance. Thank you, sirs. And for all the audience listening, for all the listeners, we appreciate your support. Subscribe, and we'll see you on the next one. God bless.